Do you know how often companies face crisis? Is it possible to be crisis-proof? And what does Swiss cheese have to do with crisis management? These and many other questions will be answered today by our special guest. Welcome everyone to 24/7 Talks Live. Good morning to our clients and 24/7 team as well. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to harness the unpredictable talk about the trends and insights from crisis management and crisis comms. My name is Twardowska. I'm Senior Advisor at 24/7 Communication in charge of crisis comms and crisis management, which will be naturally our topic today. And now, biggest, warmest welcome to our special guest, Robbert Meulemeester, Senior Advisor and Trainer, specialized in integrated crisis management and simulation games. Robbert came to us from Belgium, from the PM Risk Crisis Change Agency, which advises clients from Benelux area, but also Spain, Germany, United States, Asia, and many more. Together, our agencies are members of Crisis Communications Network Europe, a network of European communication agencies with valuable expertise in crisis management. And CCNE is, of course, partner of our today's talk. Hello, Robbert. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's very nice to be here.
So our agenda today is that we'll talk around 45 minutes about the crisis resilience, global trends, also insight from the international markets, but also about the strategies and tools to build crisis resilience. And last 15 minutes we'll devote for Q&A session. So please put already your questions into the chat. And at the end, I will ask these questions to our guest. So, Robbert, seems to me like what we all have in common, the whole globe, is that crisis will come sooner or later. Isn't that true?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I'm not a pessimist at all, but we have to be honest. In today's landscape, organizations are becoming more complex. Parts of the organization are becoming more and more interlinked. And after all, we are all humans. Organizations are made up of humans. Humans make mistakes and add it all up. And that means that every organization will face a crisis. It could be that you face multiple crises rapidly after each other. But for example, recently in Belgium, we had one of the biggest travel operators. They never had a significant crisis, but they had one after 150 years and they went bankrupt because of it.
Yeah, so crisis management is a story about people, seems like.
Yes, it's people who have to manage the crisis. Yeah,
people and procedures and trainings, but about this we'll talk a little bit later. So, do you see any national approach to face the crisis, to handle crisis from your perspective?
Yes, there are significant differences if you look worldwide. For example, the way we perceive crises is different across the world. In some cultures, for example, acknowledging the fact that you are in a crisis is already seen as a personal failure, and of course that also will influence the way of how you deal with the crisis.
How you deal also as a company, because crisis management is really teamwork, so
yes,
you need to be open at least in that team.
Yes, definitely. And another thing that also changes a lot is how we deal with crisis situations. If you look at, for example, the United States, there you have a strong focus on the legal aspect, which of course you always have to a certain extent in crisis management. But you know, the focus will be different where you are in the world. And
your approach as an expert from Belgium is that openness, transparency, or what?
It's difficult. It's easy to say, of course, but we just want to do the good thing for the people that are affected. At least for our company, that's always where we start from. Is we want to do good for the people that are affected. We want to do, of course, good for the client that potentially caused the harm, and it's a difficult balancing act. Yeah. But yeah, that's generally how we look at things.
And let's take a look for a little while for the numbers. So PwC conducted report, Global Crisis Resilience Survey, based on talks with almost 2,000 leaders from the whole world. And the question was how you handle crisis, are you crisis resilient, which is very important. And the key conclusions are as follow. So 96% of organizations have experienced disruption in the past 2 years, and 76% says that the most serious disruption had medium to high impact on operations. So it's quite a number, it's quite high. So you think it's because companies are more aware and the procedures are better, or what's the reason?
But first of all, I'm surprised that it's not 100%. But no, there's multiple things that are in play here. I think one of the things most definitely is that norms and regulations are becoming more and more strict. For example, if we look at Belgium, when it comes, for example, to certain soil pollutions, the norms are and the regulation is becoming more and more strict. So it becomes much easier to commit a violation and to be held accountable. So that's one of the reasons. Also, like I mentioned, organizations are more and more interlinked. Departments are depending on each other more and more. Software and IT systems are shared across the entire organization. There's actually a nice book about that. It's called Overcomplicated by Samuel Arbsman. And it's about how organizations are so interlinked that one minor issue in one department can actually have big consequences for the entire organization. But last but not least also is people have increasingly big expectations of companies. We expect companies to behave like a good company, and the expectations are higher than ever before, which also means that we are more victim for public scrutiny. And therefore, if you combine all of these different factors, it means that organizations are more likely than ever before to end up in a crisis.
So we have crisis because we live in more complicated world. This is how we can sum up it, but this won't change. The world will be even more complicated. So that's why my next question is, how would you define the crisis resilient? How to know like I'm crisis proof and I'm safe and I'm like easygoing with any crisis which will come because I know I'm crisis proof?
Yeah. That's a very interesting topic. Ever since the pandemic, resilience has been one of the buzzwords that is often talked about. If you look at the definition of resilience, it is truly the ability of an organization to not only bounce back after disruption, but to bounce forward and to become stronger than they ever were before. That's really what resilience is all about.
So crisis as a good lesson, and then we are even stronger. So I think it's some nice words for all of those who are afraid of crisis, that you can be even better after that.
You can compare it a little bit with if you break a bone, then it takes a little bit to heal, but then the scar tissue makes sure that the bone is stronger than it ever was before. So it's a little bit the same actually. If you look at resilience, one of the theories that we often use in our practice is the theory of Ducek from 2020. I'm not going to explain it in too much detail because it will be too detailed for this session. However, what we see in this model is that organizations need to have capacities and capabilities in 3 different stages mostly. In the anticipation phase, in the coping phase, dealing with disruption, and also in the adaptation phase, learning from it and changing. A colleague of mine, Hugo Marijnissen, he's also the co-holder of a brand new chair of crisis governance at the University of Antwerp. He has a analog that he often makes, a comparison between resilience and with the decathlon, the Olympic discipline. Yes, because people often ask, like you asked me before, is how can we measure resilience? And it's very difficult. It's difficult to measure resilience, it's difficult to train resilience. Just as it is impossible for an athlete to train for the decathlon. The decathlon is made up from throwing numbers, jumping numbers, running numbers, and you can train for each of the 10 numbers, but you cannot train for the decathlon. It's a little bit the same thing with crisis management and how it relates to resilience. You cannot train to be resilient, however, what you can do is train business continuity and become better in business continuity management. You can invest in crisis management and crisis communications capabilities. You can invest in change management.
So a bit step by step and all into this like umbrella of training, because we'll talk about it also a bit later, but you can have the best procedures, you can have everything like here, okay, I see I'm ready, but then then it's real life. And
it's not only training, of course, and it's definitely not a step-by-step approach, but it's something that you need to take into account, that there's different athletics numbers, so to speak, that will make sure that you are resilient. And the fun thing as well is that if we finish the comparison with an athlete could be very bad at the 100-meter sprint, for example, but he or she could be very good at javelin throw. So you can be very bad at certain numbers, very good at other numbers, and still win the decathlon. So this is the same thing a little bit for resilience. Companies might not be investing in business continuity management, for example. It might be fine as long as they're strong crisis managers. So that's a good approach to start looking at resilience. Instead of trying to train resilience, have a look at what are we good at, what can we improve, and how can we improve our decathlon score.
But is it possible to crisis-proof, to have this, also this kind of calmness, like, yes, I'm ready? I think yes, according to what you're saying.
Yes, I mean, you can be crisis-proof in the sense that you can be ready to act. And a colleague of mine, Stijn Pieters, he recently talked about a concept, about a study that they did at the fire services in Antwerp. And they researched that the fire services, or the firemen, they are only spending 7% of their time at an intervention. So that means that 93% of time they're just sitting in home base, training, resting, eating, playing games with each other. But for those 7%, they need to be alert and aware, and they need to do what's right. This is called mission readiness. So I think, can organizations be crisis prepared? Yes and no. You cannot prevent crisis situations. Crises will always keep happening. But you can become in a certain state where you feel so confident that you can handle a crisis, and it can happen at any moment. You are ready. And that's what we should be aiming for.
And what's the nature of today's crisis? What, according to your knowledge, your experience, what can cause them?
Yeah, this is a double question. A lot of companies try building and researching crisis barometers or kind of stuff, and then they say this year there was an uptick in this kind of crisis and whatever. In our practice, I find it difficult to confirm certain trends. What we do see, of course, is that in general we see the division between physical crisis situations and non-physical crisis situations. Because of high expectations, because of stronger norms and values of people, we see an increase in non-physical crisis situations. But if I had to choose certain types, I would say that in terms of physical crisis situations, work accident is stable, pollutions is increasing, so soil pollutions, for example, contamination of water and things like that, and also protesters. If you look at non-physical crisis situations, there, of course, IT crisis is something that's really on the rise. That happens more and more, together also with the toxic workplace situations and all kinds of scandals.
Okay, then also new unpredictable, because this is what we are always afraid a little bit of, although we are prepared, and how to prepare for something that we still don't know that will happen.
Yes. So the interesting thing here with the new unpredictables is that, like the name mentions, you cannot predict it. Could be literally anything. So I think what we absolutely need to do to be ready for the unpredictable is two things. We need to focus on building what is often called adaptive capacity, which basically means that you need to have enough people with the right competencies to handle crisis situations.
And for you, crisis team is how many people, for example?
It's difficult. The minimum, the absolute minimum for a crisis team is 4 people in our practice. But I've seen crisis teams up until 20, even more people. Of course, the bigger the crisis team becomes, the less efficient it typically becomes. There are always changes or exceptions, of course.
But the efficiency is just one more question here. Is making decision?
Sorry?
Efficiency for
Yes.
the team is handle making decision, and even if you can have few different views on the crisis, which is very often, but there needs to be someone who will make that decision according to the information that are coming.
Indeed, and if you're with 20 people making decisions, of course it will be slower than if you're with 4 people. But luckily, efficiency is not the only measure of effective crisis management today. You need to be creative, for example. You need to have the right soft skills to deal with your fellow team members around the table. So it's not only efficiency in your decision making. So that's one thing, is the adaptive capacity to be able to deal with all kinds of crises. But the other thing I would say is that companies need to invest more in having a robust framework in the sense
What's
of
that for you?
yeah, that's the part of the plan that describes how do we organize our company if we are in crisis, and that needs to be robust. And what I mean by that is that the same way you organize if your company is on fire, basically the same type of structure should be implemented when you're under an IT attack, for example. So what organizations still do a lot today is they prepare all kinds of scenarios, and the way to handle each scenario is different. And then they invest time and resources in preparing 50 scenarios. And then
You're not fan of these like big documents.
Yes, and then you have indeed a big document, but you also create a false sense of security because people think, oh, we are ready. We have 50 scenarios and our crisis plan is such a thick document. We are ready for everything. But then, of course, what happens is scenario 51 and it's not in the book. So people don't know what to do. So we need to invest in what I said is the framework, robust framework. How do we handle crisis situations? And ideally, it's a bit of the same for all kinds of crisis situations, but it's necessary to have that framework. And then, of course, adaptive capacity. Have enough people that have the right capabilities, flexibility, attitude, to deal with whatever is coming their way.
A lot to handle besides the crisis,
yes.
But this is how it is. And okay, so in your daily practice, what are the stages of building the resilience?
So there's
this
a few.
Is nice one.
Yes.
Disaster in a nice way.
Yeah. So this is the disaster incubation theory by Buddy Turner. I'm not going to explain the entire model, but basically what the model is trying to convey is that every organization is somewhere in this journey. Either you're moving towards your next crisis, or you're amidst a crisis, or you're now recovering from a crisis. So you're always somewhere in this journey. And the nice thing to focus here is on the left part of the image, which is called the incubation period. The incubation period is the phase where you're not in crisis mode, nothing's happening, but still, because we work and live in a very unpredictable environment and we work with people that make mistakes, things are now happening in your organization that might end up being a crisis. Luckily, 99% of those things do not escalate to a crisis.
It's just like we call issues, or even
Yes,
it can
yes.
stop at the very
Yes.
beginning.
For example, what we see a lot in manufacturing companies is that there is a procedure on how to handle the machine and how to produce in a safe manner the product that you're making. But people are not following the procedure because step 8 costs a lot of time and I'd rather not do step 8, so I bypass step 8 and I do step 9 instead. So 99% of the times, perhaps even more, that's not an issue. But one time it will go wrong. So, and this is happening now in organizations, is people are, going away from the norm. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. As we speak, organizations are trying to attack your IT systems, whatever. But luckily, once again, I'm not a pessimist. Most of the time, 99.99%, this doesn't escalate to a crisis. However, if you look at, I wanted to go back. Can I go back?
With the smaller one.
With the smaller one? Yes, apologies.
That's fine. It's live, so that's fine. Can I help you maybe?
Yes,
Which
can you
slide
go
would you
back?
like to see?
Yes,
Oh.
that one.
That one, yeah.
No,
please.
the for with the
Sorry
cheese,
for
with the
that,
cheese.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's unpredictable.
That's tricky one.
No, so
yeah.
we were talking about the incubation theory, and there's two interesting concepts that I would like to mention here. One is the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect, people might recognize it as part of chaos theory. It basically means that in the incubation theory, some minor things might now be happening that in the future might have huge consequences. For example, perhaps as we speak, some people are chatting with each other, they're distracted, they're clicking a link on an email that they're not seeing, and this might, within weeks, months, this might lead to a hacking attack.
Yeah, of course, and
effect.
you're really investing in the cybersecurity. You have all the programs, people are skilled, but
Yep.
there is one moment that you are really attached to different issue, and then it happens.
Yes.
Yeah, and then you have
Yeah.
crisis very often because of that.
That's a very interesting one. And then the second one that's also interesting to mention here is the Swiss cheese model from the introduction, which basically means that you might have 10 layers of protection and measures, but no measure is 100% foolproof. And once in a blue moon, a freak accident might happen where all holes in the layers of cheese are lined up, and you might end up in a crisis despite the measures that you have taken. For example, earlier this year we had a construction company that's a client of ours where there was a deadly work accident. A worker fell from more than 20 meters high and sadly died on the spot. Of course, the worker was protected by so many different layers of protection, but somehow, for reasons that the after action review and the root cause analysis need to look for, somehow all the holes in all the different layers of protection lined up perfectly, and it resulted in a freak accident. So this is what might happen in the disaster incubation period.
Yeah, but who's making these holes? It's like someone is making them. Maybe procedures, maybe system, maybe attitude, and where are they coming from?
Could be all different things. Could be because you're not following the safety procedure, so it could be a human mistake. But for example, could also be a mechanical failure where you have, for example, you need to clip yourself with some kind of safety measure to a railing. Could be that the clip fails, for example. So it could be literally everything. And somehow, normally you have sufficient redundant measures to make sure that if system A fails, you still have system B, C, and D. But somehow, once in a blue moon, like I said, all these moments might line up perfectly and end up in a freak accident.
This is very important because we say sometimes we consider crisis as a big thing to come, but it can go very slowly, step by step, small hole, then a bigger, and then suddenly you are like in the middle of the crisis. So that's why.
There's two schools of thought when you look at current literature, is that some people think that crises are isolated events, and they describe it as an event, something is happening, but the way we tend to look at it is crisis is more of a situation in which an event occurs. But a crisis situation is something that often starts growing and building for a long time until it eventually becomes a crisis. And if we then look at the model of disaster incubation theory, then what it says is that we're looking at the middle here at phase 3, the precipitating event. Something happens that leads to a crisis. What you always have, or most of the times, you have a recovery window, a short window of time where, for example, you're still able to isolate the computer that has been infected and you avoid a massive ransomware attack. Or there's a fire starting and you're still able to extinguish it before it becomes worse. If that happens, then you're in luck. Then you manage to avoid the crisis. Yes, and you were able to do the right thing in the recovery window. But of course, that's not always possible. And then what you see is the little guy laying on his back in the middle of the slide is the hell hour. Every crisis situation has a period of chaos where you don't know what is happening, where you don't know what is impacted, how broad the consequences are, and then step by step, and this is then the upward journey that you see on the slide, step by step you need to start your rescue and salvage operations, fight the negative things that the crisis is throwing at you until you reach the top of the mountain. And then what's interesting in the cultural readjustment phase is that organizations, most of the times they do a root cause analysis. It's a technical thing, but you need to have a more broader look at how could this happen, and not only evaluate the operational part, but also look at how did we deal with the crisis management, how did we deal with the crisis communications, how did we handle the overall coordination. So we need to spend time on looking back and reflecting.
Every day during the crisis, also when the crisis is happening, it's very important because before I ask you like how big this team should be according to you, but also then you need to have time to talk with your team, to say what's just after us, what's before, and how we are dealing with that. It's also important from the psychological point of view because people are simply stressed. It's not like we are ready and we won't be in the stress. We will be.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's two ways of doing these debriefs. You have the after action review at the end, which is a really thorough and comprehensive process. But if you're in the midst of a crisis situation that spans over multiple days or weeks even, then it's a good practice to do at the end of the day to do a hot debrief, which is just basically 10-15 minutes on the clock and looking back at what did we try to achieve today. What went well, what could we do better, and how can we do better tomorrow? And then you're really looking at practical improvements. What I also want to mention at the end when you do the after action review is that we should avoid looking for the person that made a mistake. This is something, luckily it happens less and less, I feel like. But in the past, it's easy, right? To just look at it, it's that employee who made a mistake, so let's fire that person and then the problem is solved. It's not time for that, and you create a bad culture in doing so, but you need to look at how did the system enable that person to make that mistake. It's a more difficult question to answer, but it's a better one. And also what I like to mention is that do not only look at what went wrong. This is also something organizations, we always want to learn from what went wrong, what could we do better, what can we do to avoid the same thing happening again in the future.
Yeah, the same thing, but still this same thing won't happen probably. Yeah, but this is definitely...
Exactly. But what they also have to do is look at what did we do good and what can we do more of. Oftentimes when we see in a crisis situation, of course, it's a difficult period. And people have a rough time in crisis, but in the end, they often come to us and they say, it was a difficult period of time, but we worked so efficiently. We made decisions so quickly, we collaborated without any effort at all. And I wish we could work as efficient as this in daily life as well. And then I think it's also important for just your day-to-day operations to learn from crisis management, because if you look at it really, crisis management is just basically good management, but with less margin of error and with more time pressure, of course.
Yeah, so they really like that, seems. Okay, so let's talk about the crisis training as a part of resilience building. The training, making that very regular, because one training is not enough very often.
Yeah, true. Perhaps just before we talk to that, when we look at training, we need to be aware of the different phases of crisis preparedness, the different stages. And the training, of course, might be scattered across all these phases, but this is perhaps a little bit of a simplification of the Turner model. This is, I think, the key takeaway of the Turner model, is that organizations might be in the awareness phase still, where they might still need to be made aware of the fact that crisis management is necessary. Some organizations still don't believe that they need to be crisis prepared. Oh, we will handle it when it happens. So they need to be made aware of the fact that you need to do some things in preparation.
It seems that if you don't experience that, it's not that easy to imagine, okay, I will have a big crisis and what will happen? I will handle, because I handle that every day. Every day I got some small crisis at my workplace, so then I can just really go on with that. But it's totally different situation. That's why also the crisis simulations are as close as possible to show this situation.
Yeah, that's interesting indeed. People often say like, oh, I deal with crisis every day, so I don't need crisis management preparation. But then often if you ask what they're dealing with, it's not crisis, it's just minor daily issues. And also if you ask, are you happy with the efficiency, or are you happy with the way then you are dealing with these daily issues? They often say, no, this is not manageable at all. So it's an extra argument to prepare for crisis. And then of course some organizations might be in the procedural phase, where there is awareness, but then you need to put on paper some guiding principles, some guiding rules. If there's a crisis, how are we going to deal with it? And that's this robust structure that I talk about, this framework. And then of course you might also be in the competency phase. There is awareness, you have a framework, but then you need to train people, then you need to work on that adaptive capacity that I talked about, and you need to really work on competencies to make people more skilled. Of course, there's more nuance to this. I mean, especially in big organizations, like some departments might be in the competencies phase already, while other departments might be in the awareness phase still, for example. So it's a bit more complex, of course. And I think it also relates perfectly to to another model, which is the popular storming, norming, performing model for group development. So we take a lot from that as well. And then if you look at why your initial question was why then train and why do you have to train a lot, I think in the end, like we started the webinar with, it's all about people. It's all about people. You might have a good document, but in the end, the document will not manage the crisis for you. It's still people who will need to execute it.
Exactly.
And a good model to think about this is you have the skills, rules, and knowledge model from Rasmussen, a social scientist. This is a model that we often use in our practice to explain a little bit what's happening in your brain when you're dealing with crisis situations. And what it basically says is that you have tasks. Every person has tasks that he or she can execute on three different levels, depending on how familiar you are with that task, but also depending on how much attention you need for that task. For example, if we look at the left-hand side, you might, and also myself, everybody has tasks on knowledge level. These are tasks that you are not familiar with, and because of that, you need a lot of attention to execute that task well. So for example, for me, I'm not too ashamed to admit it, changing a tire on my car, for example, would be a task that is on the knowledge level. I've never done it. I don't know how to do it. I might be able to do it, provided that I have, good instructions and I have all the time in the world to focus on it. So this is a task for me that is on a knowledge level.
Yeah.
If we look at the other side of the spectrum, you have tasks that are on a skill level. These are tasks that you are so familiar with, and as a result, you don't need a lot of attention. And for a lot of people, driving a car, for example, is a good example of a skill. You're driving your car, and you're no longer thinking about what gear should I be in and what pedals should I push to stop the car. And
even if you are stressed,
even if you are stressed, it happens automatically because you are so used to it.
Yeah.
And a fun fact indeed is if you look at driving a car, then you basically go across all levels. So you start at the knowledge level, but then you work your way down to the skills level. And then if you look at the middle, that's a little bit between the two of them, of course, is you have tasks where you have some kind of familiarity and therefore you need some kind of attention for it. For example, if people start assembling IKEA furniture, imagine that you're building six chairs. For the first chair, yes, you are still on knowledge level, but after chair 3, you feel like you're on regulation level. You need the book a little bit as a general guideline, but you know it already by then. So what do I mean, or what are the consequences for crisis management is that when people are stressed, emotions are running high, time pressure, whatever, what happens is our brain will shut off parts of the outside layer of our brain to protect itself, and it's basically just evolution. We cannot do anything about it. So the brain will shut off certain parts to protect ourselves and to send more resources to the other parts of the brain that makes us, keeps us alive, basically. And as a result, we lose some amount of our mental cognitive bandwidth. So in other words, we are losing a lot of mental capabilities when we are really stressed. And of course, this changes from person to person, and it changes from situation to situation. But if you look at what are the tasks that you lose first, these are the tasks that are on knowledge level, of course. Because when you are so stressed, you will not be able to take the plan, to read it carefully, to go to page 39, section B. Won't work.
So knowledge needs to be at some point transformed into the skills. Then it will be so much easier for you in the future situation.
Exactly, because this is the level that remains. The skills level is the level that remains. Even when you are stressed, the tasks that are on your skill level, you will do effortlessly. Yeah. So this is also, if you look at training, for example, you start generally by just education. What is crisis management? How to do crisis management? What are the key challenges of crisis management? Just basically just knowledge transfer. And then once you're past that point, then you're gonna start looking at how can we apply that knowledge to our specific organizational context, and how should we behave, and what can we do to handle with crisis. Then you're more on the regulation level. And then at the end, if you're done with the previous two parts, in the end, then you can start looking at exercising, training, simulating crisis situations to really work on your skills. But it's 3 different ways of dealing with trainings. But the skills level, that's basically...
Yeah, and each of them is very important, but they need to be set up in a step-by-step model.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's now assume that a crisis is happening, and what are the best strategies or tools that you can share with us today?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of things, and in preparation of this session, I had a good think about what is for me the essence of crisis management that we also implement in our practice, and I want to make sure for the viewers as well that I'm going to explain 5 things, but these are not. It's not a step-by-step, just 5 different things to take into account. I think the first one is logical, of course, but become and remain coordinated. So you need to be handling the situation in a coordinated manner. And this is, of course, obvious. However, what we see a lot, and I think this is also a message for the viewers, is that if you feel, even amidst the crisis, amidst the chaos, if you feel like we are not truly coordinated, dare to say something, because oftentimes we see organizations, they are in crisis and they're in the chaos and they're dealing with things, and then in the end they said, "Oh, we were not coordinated at all. Oof, we did not handle this." And I'm always wondering, why didn't you say something? It's better to take a sidestep, or perhaps to even take a step back, look at how are we organizing our crisis management here, and if it's not efficient, let's take some measures, organize differently to then jump 5 steps forward. So be and remain coordinated is a key thing here.
So every team member should be, also allowed to have this environment of support to say it, because sometimes it's like, okay, my boss is thinking A, so it should be A, so I won't tell anything. But this is totally not about that. This is about you telling what it means for you.
Yes, I totally agree with that. The best crisis teams are the crisis teams where there's open discussion possible and it's a psychological safe space. We dealt with a crisis situation at a bank a couple of years ago, and I remember vividly that each and every time that the CEO started the crisis meeting, he said, "Thank you everybody for all your efforts, and don't worry, once again, if you make a mistake, we will handle it. We're here for each other." And that was so valuable because it meant that you also felt like you could take ownership and you could take initiative. And if you are in a psychological unsafe space, then you will not take initiative. Then you will just follow orders, which is not the way that crisis situations are to be dealt with. So that's one. I think a second one is establishing a what's often called a battle rhythm, or some kind of cadence in your crisis management. Crisis teams sometimes have the idea somehow that it's crisis, so we should have meetings. And we should be in a meeting constantly, which is not the case. There's a moment of having meetings, and there's a moment of going back to your desk and working in silence. And it's important to establish a cadence. So for example, have a crisis meeting from 8 to 9, and then you work individually. Have a crisis meeting from 12 to 1, and then work individually. And have a crisis meeting from 4 to 5, and then work individually. So working on that cadence, establishing a rhythm is very good also for your sense of rest and calm, because what happens is when you're dealing with a crisis, there's lots of uncertainty and chaos, and as a result, people are stressed. And sometimes the only thing that you know for sure is, when are we meeting the next time? And this creates a lot of peace of mind for people. Like, it's chaos everywhere and I don't know what the hell is happening, but I know that we're going to speak each other again at 1 o'clock. And that creates, a sense of calm and control, which is very valuable. Handle crisis at the appropriate level. That's also another one. I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later. It's about, not all unwanted events, not all irregularities or true crisis situations. Some situations are best handled in the daily operations. Some situations are best handled by the department or the team. Some situations might require the activation of the corporate crisis team, but you need to carefully look at what is the best level of coordination here. Communicate clear purpose and meaningful boundaries. This relates to autonomy. So if you're working with crisis teams, it also relates to the safe space that I talked about, is everybody within the team, everybody involved with the crisis should have a good idea of, what are we trying to achieve here? What is the direction that we're working towards? And within that direction, what are the boundaries? What are the limits to which I can decide for myself? For example, I'm now together with the colleagues working for a shipping company, and they ship containers across Europe and also a lot to the UK. And we established some ground rules for crisis management. Basically, if a major crisis happens, the clear purpose is shipping full loads of essential products to the UK. Everything we're gonna do amidst the big crisis is to achieve this one objective. And within that objective, all the people have their own boundaries and their own autonomy. For example, one department might know that, okay, I'm able to make these and these and these decisions without asking for validation first. So that's very important and can make the entire process more smooth and efficient indeed. And then, of course, take care of yourself and others. Research has shown that being in a crisis team can have the same effect on your mental well-being than experiencing trauma. So therefore, we have to really, take care of each other. And if you see that people are not doing well, try to provide necessary support, try to, help that person. And also at the end of the crisis, nobody is a superhero, right? So don't just go back to daily operations, but
talk about this.
Talk about what happened, because you would be surprised how big and lasting the impact of a crisis situation on some people might be. Yeah.
Okay, so now I wanted to ask you about the situation when we have like center headquarters and the local offices of the company, and the headquarters just gave the so-called straight guidelines how to behave in the crisis. But the crisis is still local, so what's the cure here? Because we know what we should say or we shouldn't say. Sometimes the headquarters says don't say too much, but we need to handle this crisis here locally.
Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion that we have with a lot of our clients. And if you look just at the theory, best practice and the literature and whatnot, we cannot underestimate the local impact of a crisis situation. And therefore, I'm not convinced that dealing with a local situation from an HQ overseas is not always the best manner. Also, if you look at the literature, people often think that to deal with a crisis you need a clear chain of command and a chain of control, and then the local branch reports to the region and the region reports to HQ, and HQ manages and controls everybody. But this is just not true anymore, and the theory and the research also proves this. In a crisis, it's not a matter of having a clear chain of command. This is the case with easy, so to speak, easy accidents and incidents. Imagine firefighters coming to a burning building. Then you need to have a clear chain of command. You do this, you do that, you do that. But if you're dealing with a very complex and chaotic situation with lots of uncertainty, it's unfair to expect one leader to solve it all. So you need multiple leaders across the board, across all levels, to step up and take charge. So when you look at dealing with local crisis situations in big corporations, what we often like to do is to give some kind of autonomy to the local level, but with the HQ, of course, providing general direction. Yeah. And perhaps for a small example, we advised and supported a major cinema chain with cinema chains or cinemas worldwide, and we advised them during the COVID pandemic. Specifically on the crisis communications part. So what we did was, from the HQ in Belgium, we built the crisis communications framework, with the general objectives, key messages that we wanted to get out, stakeholders that we wanted to really take care of. But how to do the crisis communications, this was up to the local level. They were able to do their own crisis communications, but within the framework that corporate gave them. So I think this is a good example.
This is very helpful,
yes.
but you also still you can handle this with your team. What's the core of the crisis, and with a little bit of trust from the central. That works then.
Yeah, because if you're gonna do crisis communications from Belgium for a cinema in Canada, you will lose the local touch. And,
exactly.
It's finding that balance.
Exactly. Okay, so now we can go to the Q&A parts. If there are any questions, if not, I will start with still my questions to Robbert, but please be free to enter them. Okay, Robbert, what's your tip number 1 for crisis comms?
For crisis communications, I always go back to the same tip, and it is that we really need to start focusing more on the people that are truly affected. When we are dealing with crisis communications, organizations tend to focus on what is the media thinking, what is the press thinking, and I understand that with good reason, of course, but oftentimes when we try to focus too much on our reputation, and we try to bring the story as positive as possible, and we try to spin the entire thing. In doing so, we often forget what really matters in a real crisis situation, and that's the people that are affected, the people that are involved. And what you see is companies that in the middle of a crisis, the only thing that they do is focusing on saving their own reputation. They will harm their reputation in the long term, because people do not appreciate companies that are causing harm saving their own reputation. So oftentimes it's the other way around. If you're able to do the right things for the people that are involved and do good communications for the people that are affected, it will be beneficial for your reputation on the long term, even though you might think that you're harming your reputation in the short term. Of course, there's way more nuance to the story, but I think that's always my number 1 tip.
And if there's a major crisis, like high risk for reputation, what would you advise to do as a first in this big chaos, let's assume?
Yeah, my initial thing there is always to not act on an impulse, especially when reputation is threatened. Organizations sometimes have the tendency to want to react really quickly, and then sometimes they react in a way that if they look at their response a month later, they will say, this was not the best way of dealing with it. So do not act on an impulse, that's one thing, and also gather a multidisciplinary team. Because if it's a reputational issue, then sometimes in an organization, only like the communications department, the marketing department, and some leadership members, they will decide on the crisis response. But if you look, you really need to assemble a multidisciplinary crisis team with representatives of, yes, communications and marketing, but also representatives of your leadership team, representatives of operational teams, what's happening in the field, in the factory, whatever. So try to have different perspectives on the same thing. Because if you're only looking at it from a communications aspect, you will probably miss some things. And then your response will also not be the best one.
And what's an absolute key must-have in crisis preparedness?
A key must-have is for me to be spending time and attention on crisis management and to crisis preparation frequently. Because what we see in our practice is that organizations, they like to focus on the more fun things and the strategic challenges for the future. And in doing so, organizations, they don't really like focusing on bad things like crisis management. And I understand that, of course. But the consequence is that sometimes organizations, they just, to tick the box, they do one crisis simulation every 2 years, for example. And then after those 2 years, they say, okay, we did it, check, and now we can rest easy for 2 years before our next exercise. Yeah. But in doing so, they're not achieving this mission readiness that I talked about. Because if you only are doing crisis management every 2 years in an exercise, for example, the exercise will not be a very good one, and people will fail. And people will become even more stressed and uncertain. Yeah. And that's exactly the opposite of what you want to achieve. So my message is a key thing for crisis preparation is try to find ways to take on crisis management in a more frequent manner, but it can be low threshold. So for example, we have a card game at PM that we use, for example, in leadership meetings. Every month when leadership convenes to have their monthly meeting, we end with 15 minutes, perhaps 30 minutes of a short crisis management exercise. And instead of doing that one time every 2 or 3 years, we do it every month, but short. And this is
This is also the rhythm you need to have as a team.
Yes, because people need to be. My colleague Steny also calls it often a chronic sense of unease. You need to be ready. You need to be like a tennis player who's waiting for the other player to serve, right? You're standing there, you're waiting for the ball to come. That's a little bit the state that we're trying to achieve. And you cannot achieve that if you only do crisis management preparation once every 2, 3, 4 years. So that would be my key message.
And at the end, what's your key takeaway for our clients, for our team when dealing with crisis?
Key takeaway. Now that's
one sentence. Yeah, this is like essence of the key advices.
Adaptive capacity. I think that's the word I used the most during this session, and it's also, I think, one element that I hope the viewers take away from this is you can have procedures, you can have your documents, you can have your scenarios and whatever, but at the end of the day, it's all about adaptive capacity, having enough people, so buffer, having enough people that have the right capacity to deal with whatever is coming their way. That's going to be crucial.
That's great as a sum up. Okay, Robbert, seems that we are going to the end of our talk, so thank you very much for solid vaccination of knowledge for us, for our clients, our team, and dear audience, thank you for joining us.